There is a theory, old as dirt and twice as ignored, that the universe does not sort its dangerous things by size. It sorts them by patience. The patient ones survive. The patient ones outlast. And the patient ones, when they finally move, do not need to move twice. Maren Calloway was 11 years old, and she did not know this theory. She knew that her Saint Bernard, Clover, weighed 143 pounds, had a drool radius of approximately 4 feet, and could clear a table of its contents in one sweep of her tail without slowing down or appearing to notice she had done it. She knew that Clover was 5 years old and had never once bitten anything harder than a tennis ball, and that she slept on Maren's bed every night with her chin on Maren's ankle, and her enormous body draped across the lower half of the mattress like a fur-covered boulder that breathed. She knew that Clover was afraid of the vacuum cleaner and unafraid of everything else in the known universe, and that this combination was, in Maren's professional opinion, the funniest thing about being alive. She did not know that Clover was classified, in 31 galactic regulatory databases, as a Class 11 apex terrestrial predator. She did not know that the saliva Clover left on every surface she touched contained enzymatic compounds that 13 alien biochemistry departments had flagged as corrosive adjacent. She did not know that Clover's resting heartbeat, 62 beats per minute, fell within the acoustic signature range that the Pallori Concord used to identify dormant apex state organisms on quarantine worlds. She did not know any of this because she was 11, and Clover was her dog, and the only classification that mattered was that Clover was good. They were on relay station Tessec 4. Maren's father, Chief Structural Engineer David Calloway, had been posted there 9 months ago, and Maren had come with him because there was nowhere else for her to go, and because she would not leave the dog and the dog would not leave her, and David Calloway had learned, sometime in the first year after his wife died, that arguing with either of them was a project with no completion date. Tessec 4 was a mid-tier relay hub, 6,000 residents, mixed species, built on the junction of 3 major shipping corridors. It smelled like recycled air and ozone, and the faint chemical sweetness of Pallori incense, and its corridors were wide enough for freight carts and narrow enough that Clover's shoulders brushed both walls when she walked through the residential wing, leaving parallel trails of fur and saliva on the brushed aluminum paneling that the maintenance crew had stopped complaining about and started scheduling around. The morning it started was a Thursday by station time. Maren was in the Commons with Clover, eating breakfast. The Commons was a wide atrium on Deck 3 with long tables, a food service counter staffed by 2 Drenathi who made passable scrambled eggs and terrible coffee, and a transparent ceiling dome that let in the light of Tessec 4 host star, a warm yellow G-type that hit the tables at a steep morning angle and turned everything gold. Clover was under Maren's table. This was where Clover always was during meals, because Clover had discovered early in their posting that the Commons floor collected a remarkable quantity of dropped food, and that if she positioned herself beneath a table occupied by any of the station's Vasic children, who ate with their hands and had poor aim, she could supplement her kibble ration without effort or shame. Clover was not under a Vasic table this morning. She was under Maren's table, because Maren had told her to stay, and Clover listened to Maren with a consistency that she applied to no other being in any star system. Clover's chin was on her front paws. Her tail swept the deck in a slow metronome. Her brown eyes tracked the room with the unhurried attention of an animal that found everything mildly interesting and nothing worth getting up for. The Pallori delegation arrived at 8:14. Maren did not notice them at first. She was reading a lesson module on her datapad, something about atmospheric chemistry that she found boring, and Clover had begun to snore, which was the soft, wet, rumbling snore that sounded like a shuttle engine idling in a puddle. The delegation entered through the main corridor, 6 Pallori in formal diplomatic gray, tall and angular and blue-skinned, with elongated skulls and four-fingered hands that moved in constant subtle gestures that served as a secondary communication layer beneath their spoken language. They were accompanied by a station liaison, a Empath named Mott, who was explaining something about docking protocols in a voice that sounded exhausted. The delegation was not here for Marin. They were here for a trade negotiation with the station's Torvathi Merchant Guild, a routine quarterly affair that involved cargo tariffs and shipping lane access, and a great deal of formal posturing that Marin's father described as 6 adults agreeing on something they already agreed on while pretending they hadn't. The delegation was expected. Their accommodations were prepared. Their dietary requirements had been filed. Everything was in order. What was not in order was the creature walking behind the 6th delegate. Marin saw it and her fork stopped halfway to her mouth. It was the size of a large dog, roughly Clover's height at the shoulder but leaner, built like a greyhound crossed with something that had too many joints. Its body was covered in short, dense, iridescent fur that shifted between dark blue and violet as it moved, and it had 6 legs arranged in 3 pairs, each ending in padded digits that gripped the deck plating with a faint clicking sound. Its head was narrow, almost vulpine, with large amber eyes set wide apart and ears that rotated independently, swiveling toward sounds like satellite dishes. It wore a harness of woven silver cord across its chest, and it walked beside the 6th delegate, a tall Pallori female, with the easy precision of an animal trained to heal. It was beautiful. Marin put her fork down. "Clover," she whispered, "look." Clover opened one eye. The eye tracked the Pallori creature for approximately 2 seconds. Then Clover closed her eye and resumed snoring. The assessment was complete. The verdict was that the new animal was not food, not a threat, and not interesting enough to interrupt a nap. The Pallori delegation moved through the commons toward the diplomatic wing. The creature walked with them, silent, precise, its iridescent fur catching the sunlight from the dome in shifting bands of blue and violet. Marin watched it until it disappeared around the corridor bend, and she felt something in her chest that she recognized as the feeling she got when she saw an animal she had not met yet and wanted to meet very badly. She looked at Clover. Clover was asleep. The creature's name was Solen. Marin learned this 3 hours later, because she was 11, and because 11-year-olds on relay stations with limited entertainment options and unlimited curiosity could find out anything about anyone within half a day if they were motivated. She learned it from the station's public docking manifest, which listed the Pallori delegation's registered animals by species, designation, and handler. Solen was listed as a Pallori Vethkai classification, bonded diplomatic companion clearance level, restricted to handlers' quarters and designated common areas, threat rating, negligible. Negligible. Marin also learned, from the manifest and from 20 minutes of searching the station's reference library, that Vethkai were native to Pallori, a temperate world with low gravity and dense forests, and that they had been bred as companion animals by the Pallori for over 4,000 years. They were empaths, capable of reading and responding to their handler's emotional state through chemical and electromagnetic cues, and they had been integrated into Pallori diplomatic culture as calming presences during tense negotiations. A Vethkai in the room reportedly reduced cortisol-equivalent stress markers in Pallori by 30%. They were gentle, quiet, non-aggressive, hypoallergenic, and they ate a diet of synthetic proteins and native fruit pulp. They were, in every measurable respect, the opposite of Clover. Clover, who had, in the 9 months since their arrival on Tessic 4, accomplished the following: knocked station administrator Goran into the reflection pool on deck 5 twice, eaten an entire tray of Drenathi ceremonial pastries intended for a trade delegation's welcome dinner, shed enough fur to clog 3 air filtration units in the residential wing, slobbered on every accessible surface below 4 feet, broken 2 chairs in the Commons by sitting on them, and on one occasion that David Calloway still refused to discuss in detail. Somehow gotten into the station's hydroponic bay and eaten half a row of something that turned out to be a Torvathi medicinal herb worth 600 credits per kilogram. Clover was not a diplomatic companion. Clover was a natural disaster with a wagging tail, and Marin loved her with a ferocity that was beyond language. There had been a formal complaint, 3 formal complaints actually. The first from the Torvathi Merchant Guild regarding the medicinal herb incident, which had included an itemized invoice and a 20-minute lecture from the guild's senior representative, a broad-shouldered reptilian named Torvekin, who had stood in David Calloway's quarters and pointed at Clover with a claw the size of a dinner fork and said, in precise Terran standard, "That animal is an economic hazard." Clover had been asleep on the bed during the lecture, her tail thumping softly against the mattress, and Torvekin had watched the tail and said nothing else and left. The second complaint was from the maintenance division, requesting that the Calloway family either contain, leash, or relocate the Class 11 Apex companion that was depositing biological material on station infrastructure at a rate that exceeded the cleaning protocol's design capacity. The third was from Gorin himself, filed the day after the second reflection pool incident, and it was only 1 sentence long. Please keep the dog off Deck 5. David Calloway had paid the Torvathi invoice. He had apologized to maintenance. He had promised Gorin that Clover would stay off Deck 5, a promise that held for exactly 11 days before Clover found the access ramp and was discovered asleep in the pool's shallow end, her enormous body displacing enough water to flood the adjacent corridor by half an inch. Gorin had looked at the dog. The dog had looked at Gorin. Gorin had sighed in a way that suggested he had accepted a fundamental truth about the universe and was not happy about it but had stopped fighting. Marin had watched all of this with the serene detachment of an 11-year-old who knew that her dog was impossible and did not care. But Solène. Marin thought about Solène all day. She thought about the iridescent fur and the wide amber eyes, and the silent, precise way the creature had moved through the Commons like a piece of light given legs. She thought about what it would feel like to touch fur that changed color. She thought about a creature that could feel what you felt and respond to it, and she thought about how different that was from Clover, who responded to what Marin felt by putting her enormous head in Marin's lap and breathing on her until the feeling went away, which was not empathy but was, in Marin's experience, usually better. She wanted to meet Solène. She wanted it the way she wanted most things, which was completely and without strategy. At 14:30, she found out where the Pallori delegation's quarters were. At 14:45, she was standing in the corridor outside the diplomatic suite on Deck 7 with Clover beside her, 143 pounds of St. Bernard sitting on the polished deck, with drool pooling beneath her jowls and her tail thumping against the wall, in a rhythm that sounded like someone knocking very slowly on a very large drum. The door opened. The tall Pallori female, Solène's handler, stood in the doorway. Her name, Marin would learn later, was Delegate Yuri. She was slender even by Pallori standards, with skin the color of deep water and the 4-fingered hands moving in small, unconscious patterns at her sides. She looked down at Marin. Then she looked at Clover. Her hands stopped moving. "You are the engineer's offspring," she said. Her Terran standard was precise, accented, each word placed like a tile in a mosaic. The one with the Class 11 Apex companion. "She's not a Class 11, Marin said. She's a dog." "She is both," Yuri said. Behind her in the dim interior of the suite, Marin saw movement, a flash of iridescent blue-violet. Solène. Marin's breath caught. "Can I meet her?" Yuri looked at Clover again. The St. Bernard was sitting with her tongue out, her eyes half closed, her tail still thumping. The pool of drool had expanded to a radius that was approaching Yuri's feet. There was a piece of what appeared to be scrambled egg stuck in the fur on Clover's chest. "Your companion," Yuri said carefully. "She is trained to a protocol." "She knows sit and stay," Marin said, "and shake. And she'll come when I call her, mostly. Mostly. If she's not eating." "The Vethkai is sensitive to environmental aggression," Yuri said. "Emotional volatility in a room can cause distress. Solen has not been exposed to a Terran apex species." "Clover isn't volatile," Marin said. "She's asleep." This was true. Clover had, at some point during the conversation, transitioned from sitting to lying on her side with her legs extended and her eyes fully closed. Her tail had stopped thumping. Her breathing was slow and deep. She had elected to take a nap on the diplomatic corridor's floor, and no amount of diplomatic protocol was going to change that. Yuri stared at the sleeping Saint Bernard for a long time. Then she stepped aside. "You may enter," she said. "Briefly." Marin stepped over Clover's legs and into the suite. Solen was standing on a raised platform near the viewport, her 6 legs arranged in a resting posture that looked like a sculpture, her narrow head tilted, her amber eyes fixed on Marin. The iridescent fur rippled, blue to violet to blue, and Marin understood suddenly that the color shift was not random, that it was a response, that Solen was reading the room the way Clover read a scent trail, pulling data from the air and translating it into something visible. Marin stopped 3 feet away. She held very still. Solen's ears rotated forward. The fur along her spine settled into a steady deep blue, the color, Marin would learn, of curiosity without alarm. One of Solen's forepaws lifted and extended toward Marin, the padded digits spreading, and Marin understood the gesture without being told. She extended her hand, palm up, and Solen's paw settled onto it, light as paper, warm, the pads smooth and dry. The fur where their skin touched turned gold. "She likes you," Yuri said from the doorway. There was something in her voice that sounded like surprise. "That is uncommon. Vethkai do not typically respond to non-Pallori." Marin was not listening. She was looking at the gold spreading up Solen's foreleg like sunlight climbing a wall, and she was feeling something she could not name, a warmth that started in her palm and moved up her arm and settled in her chest, and she thought, "This is what it feels like when something understands you without words." Behind her in the corridor, Clover sneezed in her sleep, and a strand of drool detached from her jowl and landed on the deck with a sound like a small, wet flag being dropped. 2 worlds, 2 animals, 2 entirely different languages of love. Marin was fluent in both. That evening she told her father about Solen over dinner in their quarters. David listened. Clover was on the floor beside the table, her chin on Marin's foot, her body occupying a floor area roughly equivalent to a single-bed mattress. Halfway through the conversation, Clover stood up, walked to the kitchenette counter, and in one smooth motion lifted her massive head and swept David's half-eaten plate of reconstituted noodles off the surface with her nose. The plate hit the floor. The noodles scattered. Clover ate them in 4 bites, looked at David with her soft brown eyes, and lay back down on Marin's foot. David looked at the empty plate. He looked at the dog. "So this alien animal," he said evenly, "is hypoallergenic, empathic, and perfectly behaved." "Yes. And ours eats my dinner off the counter." She was hungry. She ate her own dinner 20 minutes ago. I watched her eat it. It took her 9 seconds. She's a growing dog. She is 5 years old and 143 pounds. She has finished growing. She has been finished growing for 3 years. David looked at Clover. Clover's tail swept the floor once, slow and unbothered. Did the alien animal steal any dinners? "Solen eats synthetic protein pellets from a silver bowl," Marin said. "She eats exactly the right amount and then stops." David was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "We do not live in a universe where dogs stop." This was true. This was the truest thing anyone on the station had ever said about Clover, and Marin wrote it down on her datapad later that night, not because she needed to remember it, but because some truths deserved to be recorded. The next 4 days were the best 4 days Marin had experienced since arriving on Tesek 4. She visited Solen every afternoon. Yuri allowed it, initially with visible reluctance and then with something closer to curiosity, because Solen's response to Marin was, by Yuri's own admission, unprecedented. The Vethkai's fur turned gold every time Marin entered the room, not the pale gold of casual interest, the deep, saturated gold of recognition, of chosen affinity. Solen would cross the room to Marin before Marin was fully through the door, and she would press her narrow head against Marin's hip and stand there, 6 legs perfectly still, fur blazing, and Marin would put her hand on Solen's back and feel the warmth travel through her like a current. Clover came to the visits. She had to, because Marin could not leave her alone in their quarters without Clover finding something to destroy, and because Clover's separation anxiety manifested not as barking or whining, but as a systematic and methodical consumption of anything within reach, which on one memorable occasion had included David Calloway's work boots, a datapad, and the leg of a chair. So Clover came. She walked into the diplomatic suite like she walked into every room, which was with the absolute confidence of an animal that assumed the room had been built for her, and she lay down on the floor in the corner nearest the viewport and slept. Solen watched Clover with a fascination that bordered on alarm. The Vethkai had never been in the same room as a Terran animal, and the data she was pulling from Clover's presence was clearly overwhelming. On the first visit, Solen's fur had cycled through blue, violet, amber, deep green, and a color Yuri called thalkes, which translated roughly as information I do not have a category for. On the second visit, Solen had approached Clover while the St. Bernard slept and stood over her for 11 minutes without moving, her 6 legs locked, her ears forward, her fur running through a spectrum Yuri said she had never seen. On the third visit, Clover woke up, looked at Solen standing over her, and yawned. The yawn was enormous. It revealed every tooth in the St. Bernard's mouth, a collection of white enamel designed by 300 million years of terrestrial evolution to grip, tear, crush, and hold. The yawn lasted 4 seconds. Clover's jaw opened to an angle that would have dislocated a Pallori skull. Her tongue curled. A rope of drool stretched between her upper and lower canines and detached with an audible snap. Then the yawn closed, and Clover blinked, and her tail moved once, and she set her chin back on her paws and closed her eyes. Solen had not moved during the yawn. She had stood perfectly still, her amber eyes wide, her fur cycling through colors so fast that Yuri had stopped trying to name them and simply watched. When the yawn was over and Clover was back asleep, Solen's fur settled into a color Marin had not seen before. Bright green, threaded with gold. "What's that one?" Marin asked. "I do not know," Yuri said. She sounded genuinely unsettled. In 4,000 years of Vethkai breeding records, that color has not been documented. My companion is experiencing an emotional state that my species has never catalogued. She looked at Clover. Because of a yawn. On the fourth visit, Solen lay down beside Clover. Not next to her, against her. Solen pressed her lean, iridescent body against Clover's massive flank, and her fur turned a color it had never turned before, a deep, steady amber that Yuri watched with her 4-fingered hands completely still for the first time since Marin had met her. "That color," Marin said, "what does it mean?" Yuri did not answer immediately. She watched Solen lying against the sleeping St. Bernard, the Vethkai's body rising and falling with Clover's breathing, her amber eyes half closed, her fur pulsing gently with each of Clover's heartbeats. "Safe," Yuri said. "It means she feels safe." Marin sat on the floor between the two animals, one hand on Solen's silk-fine fur and one hand buried in Clover's thick, coarse coat, and she thought that this was what it meant to have enough. The parallel threads of her days ran like this. Mornings with Clover in the Commons, eating breakfast under the dome while the St. Bernard hoovered crumbs from the deck and left drool trails that the maintenance crew tracked on their shift logs with resigned precision. Afternoons with Solène in the diplomatic suite, sitting on the floor while the Vethkai leaned against her knee, and Clover slept in the corner and Yuri worked at her console, and occasionally looked over at the three of them with an expression Marin could not read. Evenings with her father in their quarters, Clover on the bed taking up 2/3 of the mattress, Marin wedged into the remaining third with her back against the wall and her feet tucked under the dog's haunches, telling David about her day. "She turned gold again," Marin said, "the second I walked in." David looked at her. He was a large man, quiet, with hands that had been broken twice in structural collapses and healed slightly crooked, and he had the same way of listening that Clover did, which was completely and without interruption. "You know the delegation leaves in 3 days," he said. "I know. And Solène goes with them." "I know." He did not say anything else. He did not need to. Marin knew. She had known since the first afternoon, since the first touch of gold on Solène's fur, since the first moment she had understood that this was borrowed. All of it. The visits, the gold, the warmth in her chest. Borrowed from a schedule that had an end date printed on a docking manifest. Clover put her chin on Marin's ankle. Her tail swept the blanket once. Some things did not have end dates. On the 5th day, the station's proximity alarms triggered at 3:47. Marin woke to the sound and to Clover's weight shifting on the bed, the St. Bernard's head lifting, ears forward, brown eyes open and steady in the dark. Not alarmed. Not panicked. Aware. Clover did not bark. She never barked. She simply looked at the door and waited, her body still, her breathing even, and the weight of her, the sheer gravitational fact of 143 pounds of calm, held the room in place. David was up and dressed in 40 seconds. He kissed the top of Marin's head and said, "Stay here, keep Clover with you, I'll be back." He left. Marin sat in the dark with her arms around Clover's neck and listened to the station wake up around her. Voices in the corridor, tight and fast. The hum of bulkhead seals cycling. The amber advisory tone that meant elevated alert, not full lockdown. Something was wrong, but not catastrophically wrong. Not yet. Clover's heartbeat was slow against Marin's ribs. 62 beats per minute. The same in the dark as in the light. The same in danger as at rest. There was a lesson in that, Marin thought. There was a lesson in being the thing that did not change. She learned later what had happened. A debris field from a derelict freighter had drifted into Tesek 4 approach corridor, and a Torvathi cargo hauler making its final approach had clipped the largest fragment and lost its port thruster array. The hauler had spun into a lateral vector that put it on a collision heading with the station's lower docking ring. Station defense had fired the emergency tethers, caught the hauler, and arrested its momentum, but the impact of the tether contact had sent a shockwave through the lower decks that blew 3 bulkhead seals, vented 2 cargo bays to vacuum, and shattered the transparency panels on deck 3. The Commons dome cracked. Marin did not know this until later. What she knew, in the dark in her quarters, was that the station shuddered once hard, like a giant had struck it with an open palm, and the lights flickered, and Clover's body tensed for exactly 1 second and then relaxed, and the dog pressed closer against Marin's side with the deliberate weight of an animal that had decided its job was to be an anchor. The shudder passed. The lights came back. The advisory tone continued, steady. Amber and Marin waited because her father had told her to wait, and because Clover was warm and calm and the room was holding. 20 minutes later, her door chimed. She opened it expecting her father. It was Yuri. The Pallori delegate was standing in the corridor in what appeared to be sleepwear, a long pale robe with her 4-fingered hands wrapped around herself, and her face had an expression that Marin had never seen on an alien before. It took her a moment to place it. Terror. The kind that made your hands shake. "Marin," Yuri said, "Solène is gone." The words landed like stones. "The shockwave," Yuri said. "The impact displaced the door seal on my suite, a structural deformation. The door opened and would not reseal, and when I turned, she was gone. She ran." The corridor was full of people, and there was noise, and Vethkai are prey-response animals. Marin, they flee from chaos. It is wired into them. They do not fight, they run, and she is somewhere on this station, and she is alone, and she is terrified, and her fur, Yuri's voice broke. Her fur will be white, full white. That is the fear response. Total overload. If she stays in it too long, the neural feedback can cause permanent damage. Sensory collapse. She will stop being able to feel anything. She will stop being Solène. Marin looked at Clover. Clover looked at Marin. The Saint Bernard stood up. She shook herself once, the full-body ripple that started at her head and traveled to her tail and sent a spray of drool and loose fur in a 3-foot radius. She walked to the door and stood beside Yuri and looked up at her with the patient, brown-eyed gaze of an animal that was waiting to be told where to go. Marin pulled on her boots. "We'll find her," she said. Tesek 4 was not designed to be searched by an 11-year-old girl and a 143-pound Saint Bernard. It was 6,000 residents across 12 decks, a labyrinth of corridors and service tunnels and cargo bays and hydroponic wings and maintenance shafts and ventilation networks that branched like the root system of a tree. The shockwave damage had sealed off 3 sections of the lower decks. Emergency bulkheads had dropped across 4 corridors. The maintenance crew was running damage assessment. The Commons dome was shattered, the atrium closed, the breakfast tables covered in transparent shards that caught the starlight like scattered teeth. Yuri had reported Solène's disappearance to station security. Station security had logged it, assigned it a priority code, and told her they would begin a search as soon as the damage assessment was complete. Their estimate was 4 to 6 hours. Yuri had explained about the neural feedback. Station security had noted it. Their estimate remained 4 to 6 hours. Marin did not have 4 to 6 hours. Solène did not have 4 to 6 hours. And the people who could have helped did not understand what was at stake, because they had never seen gold fur and did not know what it meant to lose it. Yuri had tried the station's internal biosensor grid. Solène's species was not in the database. The grid could not track what it could not identify. She had tried the environmental monitoring system, scanning for the electromagnetic signature that Vethkai emitted. The shockwave had knocked out sensor coverage on 4 decks. The gaps in the grid were exactly the places a frightened animal would run to, the dark places, the quiet places, the places where the noise stopped. Marin stood in the corridor outside Yuri's suite and looked at Clover. Clover looked back. Her brown eyes were steady, her ears forward, her breathing even. She was not reading the room. She was not processing emotional cues. She was 143 pounds of Terran apex predator, who had smelled every corridor on this station during 9 months of walks and naps and unauthorized excursions, and she was waiting for a word. Marin said, "Find." It was not a command she had trained. It was not a word that Clover had been conditioned to respond to in any formal behavioral framework. But Clover was a Saint Bernard, and Saint Bernards had been bred in the Swiss Alps for 300 years to find people who were lost in places they should not be, and the breeding was not a skill that required a classroom. It was a bone-deep instruction set, written in genetics and reinforced by 10,000 generations of dogs who had walked into snowstorms and come back with the missing. Clover's nose dropped to the deck. She pulled forward on the lead, not hard, not frantic, just the steady, insistent pressure of a dog that had caught something and was following it with the same methodical persistence she applied to following a crumb trail across the commons floor. Her nostrils flexed, pulling air across the olfactory receptors, hundreds of millions of them, each one sorting the chemical information into a map that no instrument on the station could replicate. The map said, something went this way, something afraid. Something that smelled like synthetic protein and copper, and electromagnetic static and fear. Marin followed. They went down. Away from the residential decks, away from the diplomatic wing, away from the well-lit corridors with their brushed aluminum walls and their polished deck plating. Down into the maintenance levels, where the air was cooler and the lighting was industrial yellow and the corridors narrowed to service width, barely wide enough for Clover's shoulders. Clover did not slow down. Her body moved with a purpose Marin had never seen in her before, not the lazy amble of her daily walks, not the excited bouncing of meal time, but something older and deeper, something that came from a place in the dog that Marin had never needed to reach. Yuri followed behind them, silent, her hands shaking, her tall frame bent slightly in the low corridors, her face locked in an expression of concentrated fear that Marin could see every time she looked back. They passed through a service junction where two maintenance techs, Vasek, short and scaled and broad-shouldered, were sealing a ruptured coolant line. One of them looked at Clover and stepped back instinctively, pressing against the wall. Clover did not look at him. She did not look at anything except the floor and the air and the invisible thread that her nose was following through the station's guts. Deck 9. A damage control team was sealing a cracked conduit at the next junction. 3 Vasek techs with welding rigs and a Keth Varii supervisor who saw Clover coming down the corridor and pressed himself against the wall, both hands flat on the paneling. Clover did not acknowledge him. She did not acknowledge the sparks from the welding rig or the hiss of pressurized sealant or the amber warning strobes cycling on the ceiling. She walked through the middle of the repair site like it was a park, and she was on her evening walk, nose down, nostrils working, the lead trailing behind her on the deck, because Marin had given up trying to keep pace and was half jogging to match the dog's steady, inexorable stride. She is following something, Yuri said. She can detect Solen's chemical signature. She can detect anything, Marin said. She's a dog. Yuri did not respond to this. She was watching Clover with the focused attention of a diplomat whose entire professional training had been in reading subtle emotional cues, watching an animal that had no subtlety whatsoever and did not require any. Deck 10. A sealed bulkhead that had dropped during the shockwave, and Marin's heart stopped because the corridor dead-ended, but Clover turned left, following the scent through a ventilation access panel that had been knocked loose by the impact. The panel hung at an angle from one remaining bolt, and the gap behind it was dark and narrow and smelled like machine oil and recycled air. Clover did not hesitate. She pushed through, her massive shoulders scraping both sides of the gap, leaving twin streaks of fur on the metal, and Marin got on her knees and crawled through after her. Yuri, who was too tall for the gap, folded herself through it with the desperate flexibility of someone who would have crawled through fire. Her robes caught on the bolt. She tore them free without stopping. On the other side of the panel, a maintenance shaft led down at a steep angle. Clover took it at a walk, her claws finding purchase on the textured surface, her body moving with a certainty that said this was not exploration. This was not wandering. This was a dog that knew exactly where she was going. Deck 11, the hydroponics wing. The long rows of growing trays under UV panels, the humid air thick with chlorophyll and nutrient solution, the sound of water cycling through the irrigation lines. The wing was empty. It had been evacuated during the alert. Clover stopped. She stood in the aisle between 2 rows of Drenathi grain trays, her nose up now, pulling scent from the air instead of the floor, and her tail was still, and her ears were forward, and her body was locked in a posture that Marin recognized from every documentary about working dogs she had ever watched. She had found it. Whatever she had been following, she had found it, and she was not moving because the next step was Marin's. Marin looked. Under the third growing tray, pressed into the narrow gap between the tray's base and the deck, was Solène. Vethkai was small, smaller than Marin remembered. She had compressed herself into a space that should not have fit her, her 6 legs folded tight against her body, her narrow head tucked beneath her forepaws, and her fur, her beautiful, iridescent, expressive fur, was white. Not pale, not faded. White. The pure, flat, terrible white of an animal whose entire sensory system had overloaded and shut down, and the white was not shifting, not pulsing, not responding to anything. It was static. Dead light. Solène's eyes were open. They were not tracking. They were fixed on nothing, amber gone dull, the pupils wide and unresponsive. Yuri made a sound behind Marin that was not a word in any language. It was the sound of someone watching something they loved disappear, while they stood close enough to touch it. "How long?" Marin whispered. "Too long," Yuri said. "The feedback has been running for, I do not know, perhaps an hour, perhaps more. If I touch her, my distress will feed into the loop. Vethkai read their handler first. She will feel my fear and it will make it worse. I cannot," her voice broke again. "I cannot reach her without hurting her." Marin looked at Clover. The Saint Bernard was standing over Solène, not over her exactly, near her. Close enough that her shadow fell across the Vethkai's white body, and her breathing was audible in the quiet of the empty hydroponics wing. Slow and deep and steady, 62 beats per minute, the resting heartbeat of an apex terrestrial predator that had never once in its life needed to be anything other than calm. Marin unclipped Clover's lead. "Down," she said. Clover looked at Marin. Then she looked at the small white creature beneath the growing tray. Then she did what Saint Bernards had done for 300 years when they found something lost and cold and afraid in a place it should not be. She lay down. Not beside Solène, around her. Clover lowered herself to the deck with the slow, deliberate grace of an animal that understood, on some level beyond language, that the small thing under the tray needed to be enclosed, not approached. She curled her massive body in a C-shape around the gap, her flank against the tray's base, her head near Solène's tucked forepaws, and she let out a long, slow breath that stirred the Vethkai's white fur and carried on it every chemical signal that a 143-pound earth dog produced at rest. Warmth, calm, the enzymatic signature of an animal whose heartbeat said, "I am here, and I am not leaving, and there is nothing in this room that I am afraid of." Nothing happened. For 30 seconds, nothing happened, and Marin felt the floor of her stomach drop, and beside her Yuri was perfectly still, and the hydroponics wing hummed with its water and its UV light and its silence. Then a patch of fur on Solène's shoulder shifted. Not gold, not blue, not any color Marin had seen before. A deep, warm amber, the color of safe, spreading from the point nearest Clover's body like ink dropped in water, crawling across the white in slow, uneven pulses that followed the rhythm of Clover's breathing. 1 pulse, 2, 3. The amber spread down Solène's flank, across her folded legs, up her neck. Solène's ear twitched. Her pupils contracted. One of her forepaws extended, slowly, trembling, and it touched Clover's jowl, and the amber deepened to gold where the contact was made. And Clover did not move, did not flinch, did not do anything except breathe and be warm and be 143 pounds of the most patient, most certain, most unshakable thing in the room. Solène's head lifted. Her eyes found Marin. The gold spread across her entire body, and it was not the gold of curiosity this time, not the gold of recognition. It was something else, something Marin did not have a word for and did not need one. She crawled forward on her hands and knees and put her palm on Solène's side, and the fur was warm, and the gold pulsed under her fingers, and Solène leaned into her hand and let out a sound that was not a word and was not a cry, and was something between the two, the sound of a creature that had been lost in its own fear and had been found. Not by someone who could speak its language, but by someone whose language was weight and warmth, and the steady drum of a heartbeat that did not know how to be afraid. Behind them, Yuri slid down the wall to the floor and put her face in her four-fingered hands and wept. They stayed on the floor of the hydroponics wing for a long time. Marin did not know how long. She knew that Solen's fur continued to pulse gold against Clover's flank, and that Clover's breathing never changed, never quickened, never faltered, and that the UV panels hummed overhead and the water cycled through the irrigation lines, and the world was quiet and warm and held together by the weight of a dog that did not know what she had done and would not have cared if she had. Clover did not need to understand. She had never needed to understand. She only needed to be there, and she was, and that was the entire mechanism. That was the technology. 143 pounds of body heat and patience, and an immune system that could eat the world, and a heartbeat that never varied, and a complete, absolute, bone-deep refusal to leave. Yuri stopped crying. She wiped her face with the sleeve of her robe. She looked at the two animals lying together on the deck, the massive earth dog and the delicate alien empath, and she was quiet for a long time, and then she said, "The Pallori conquered has spent 11 centuries developing artificial ambient stabilization systems for Vethkai, neural dampening fields, chemical diffusers, harmonic resonance chambers. The most advanced one costs 400,000 credits and requires a dedicated power supply and a team of 3 technicians." She looked at Clover. "Your dog drools on the floor and naps." "Yes," Marin said. "And it works better." Marin said, "She works better." Yuri closed her eyes. When she opened them, there was something in her expression that Marin had not seen before. Not surprise, not bewilderment, something closer to the look on Goran's face after the second reflection pool incident. The look of someone who had accepted a fundamental truth about the universe and was not happy about it but had stopped fighting. Marin carried Solen back to the diplomatic suite. Not literally. Solen walked, but she walked pressed against Marin's leg, her 6 legs matching Marin's pace exactly, her fur a steady, pulsing gold, and on Marin's other side, Clover walked with her lead trailing and her tongue out and her tail swinging in the slow, satisfied wag of a dog who had done her job and was ready for breakfast. They were seen. The corridors were busy now, the station waking into its damage repair rhythm, and the sight of them, the small human girl between 2 animals, one alien and golden, one terrestrial and enormous and drooling, stopped traffic in every corridor they passed through. A pair of Torvathi cargo handlers pressed against the wall. A Dranathi cook put her hand over her mouth. A Vosic maintenance tech turned to his partner and said something in Vosic that his partner answered with a single word that the station's translator rendered as approximately, "Yes." Mott, the Kethvarii liaison, met them at the diplomatic wing junction. He looked at the 3 of them. He looked at Yuri, walking behind them, her face wet, her hands still. He looked at Clover, who had at some point during the walk shaken herself, and deposited a layer of fur and drool on the corridor wall that would require a maintenance request. "I will note," Mott said, "that the Class 11 Apex Companion left the approved residential zone without an escort." "She was the escort," Marin said. Mott opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again, closed it again. He looked down at his datapad. He looked at the drool trail on the corridor wall. He made a note that Marin suspected was not going to be a citation. He stepped aside. In the corridor behind them, the Dranathi cook who had put her hand over her mouth was speaking rapidly into a comm unit. The Torvathi cargo handlers were standing together, watching the girl and the 2 animals walk away, and one of them turned to the other and said something that the station's translation system did not catch but whose tone carried perfectly. It was the tone of someone revising a category. By the time they reached the diplomatic wing, 3 more station personnel had found reasons to be in the corridor. A maintenance tech adjusting a panel that did not need adjustment. A dock worker checking a manifest on a wall terminal he had walked past every day for 2 years without touching. a Keth-Vari medic who was technically off shift and was carrying a coffee that had gone cold because she had been holding it for 15 minutes without drinking it. None of them said anything. All of them watched. The girl, the dog, the glowing alien creature pressed against the girl's leg, the trail of drool and shed fur that followed them like a wake. They reached the suite. Solène walked through the door and went to her platform by the viewport and lay down, and her fur settled into the deep blue of contentment, and her eyes closed, and her breathing slowed, and she was Solène again. Clover walked into the suite behind her. She looked at the platform. She looked at the floor beside the platform. She lay down on the floor, her chin on her paws, her body positioned between the platform and the door in a posture that was not guarding and was not blocking, and was simply being in the place where she had decided to be, which was between the vulnerable thing and whatever might come next. Marin sat on the floor between them. Yuri stood in the doorway for a long time. On Pallori, she said, we breed the Vethkai for sensitivity, for emotional resonance, for the ability to read a room and respond to it. We have been doing this for 4,000 years. We consider it our finest achievement in companion animal design. She paused. Your species bred that dog to walk into snowstorms and find strangers. Yes, Marin said. She is not sensitive. She does not read the room. She does not respond to emotional states. No. She is a blunt instrument. She's a warm one. Yuri looked at Clover. The Saint Bernard had begun to snore. The drool was pooling on the suite's polished floor. One of her rear paws was twitching in a dream. We spent 4,000 years refining empathy, Yuri said. Your species spent 300 years refining stubbornness. She paused again. The stubbornness saved my companion. She did not say anything else. The next morning, Goran summoned David Calloway to his office. Marin learned about this from her father at dinner, told in his usual quiet, careful way, the way he told her everything important, which was directly and without decoration. The station administrator wanted to discuss Clover's off-limits status, David said. He was eating reconstituted pasta and looking at the dog with an expression that might have been pride or might have been exhaustion. Clover was on the floor beside the bed, gnawing on something that Marin was fairly certain was not food. Is she in trouble? She's been removed from the restricted movement list. Marin stopped eating. What? Goran received a formal request from Delegate Yuri. The request was co-signed by the senior Pallori trade representative, who apparently heard about what happened from Yuri's incident report. The request asked that the Class 11 Terran companion be granted unrestricted access to all station common areas and diplomatic zones for the remainder of the delegation's stay. Goran agreed. Goran said, and I am quoting him directly, the dog has already been everywhere on this station at least once. The paperwork is a formality. David paused. He also waived the outstanding cleaning citations. Marin looked at Clover. The Saint Bernard had finished gnawing on the not-food object and was now lying on her side with her legs extended, her tongue hanging out, and her tail moving in the slow, satisfied sweep that meant she had accomplished something she considered important. The not-food object, Marin could now see, was a piece of insulation casing from the wall panel beside the bed. She decided not to mention this. Dad. Yeah. Can we keep her? David looked at Marin, then he looked at Clover, then he looked at the chewed insulation casing. We were always going to keep her, he said. The delegation was scheduled to depart in 2 days. Marin knew this. She had known it since the beginning, the way you know that summer ends, not as a surprise but as a fact that sits in your chest and gets heavier each day. She spent those 2 days in the suite with both animals, sitting on the floor, one hand on Solène's gold-pulsing fur and one hand on Clover's coarse, drool-dampened coat, and she tried not to count the hours and counted them anyway. Solène knew. The Vethkai was an empath, and she could feel Marin's grief the way she could feel Marin's joy, and her fur responded to it, shifting from gold to a soft, aching blue-violet that Yuri watched with an expression that said she knew exactly what the color meant and wished she didn't. Clover did not know. Clover knew that Marin was sad, because dogs knew when their people were sad, but she did not know why, and her response was the same response it had always been. She put her head in Marin's lap and breathed on her until the world got smaller and warmer and more manageable. On the second-to-last afternoon, Marin brought Clover to the suite as usual, and Clover lay in her corner as usual, and Solène crossed the room to Marin as usual, her fur blazing gold, and everything was the same except that it was ending, and the sameness was what made it unbearable. Marin sat on the floor and held both animals and watched the host star move across the viewport window and tried to memorize the weight of the moment, the specific pressure of Solène's narrow head against her hip, the specific texture of the gold fur under her palm, the specific temperature of the warmth that traveled from the Vethkai's body into hers. She wanted to keep it. She knew she couldn't. She was 11, and she had already learned that love did not come with a storage function. That night she did not tell her father about the visit. She lay in bed with Clover on her legs, the St. Bernard's weight like a warm sandbag across her shins, and she stared at the ceiling and did not sleep, and Clover did not sleep either. The dog lay with her eyes open, her chin on Marin's ankle, and her tail did not move, and her breathing was steady, and Marin understood that Clover did not know what was happening but knew that something was wrong, and her response to something being wrong was the same as her response to everything else, which was to be there. On the last afternoon, Yuri sat on the floor beside Marin. It was the first time the delegate had sat on the floor. Her long legs folded beneath her, and her four-fingered hands rested on her knees, and she looked at the two animals sleeping against each other. Solène's lean, iridescent body pressed against Clover's massive flank, 6 legs curled, fur amber, breathing in sync, and she was quiet for a long time. "I have submitted a report to the Pallori Diplomatic Corps," she said, "regarding the incident, regarding Solène's recovery, regarding the mechanism of that recovery." Marin did not look up. "What did you call it?" "I called it what it was. Terran Apex Companion Intervention in a Vethkai Neural Cascade Event. The Corps has asked me to recommend a protocol for future incidents involving Vethkai emotional overload in multi-species stations." "What did you recommend?" "I recommended a dog." Marin looked at her. "I recommended," Yuri said, "that any station housing a Vethkai diplomatic companion should also house a Terran canine of appropriate temperament. The formal recommendation uses the terminology ambient stabilization through apex companion proximity. The informal summary, which I did not include in the report, is that 4,000 years of breeding for sensitivity produced an animal that breaks in a crisis. 300 years of breeding for stubbornness produced one that does not. The optimal configuration is both." She paused. "I have also submitted the recommendation under a codified designation because the Corps requires one." "What designation?" "Protocol C11S, Yuri said. "The C is for canine, the 11 is the threat classification. The S stands for the Terran word I have been trying to translate for 2 days and cannot, because Pallori does not have an equivalent." "What word?" "Steadfast." Marin's eyes burned. She buried her face in Clover's neck and breathed in the smell of dog, the old familiar smell of kibble and station air, and the faint chemical sweetness of whatever Clover had gotten into in the hydroponics wing, and she held on. The delegation left at 600 the next morning. Marin stood in the docking corridor with Clover beside her and watched Solène walk up the boarding ramp into the Pallori transport. The Vethkai moved with the same silent precision she had shown that first morning in the Commons, 6 legs clicking, fur shifting blue to violet in the corridor's bright overhead light. Halfway up the ramp, Solène stopped. She turned. Her amber eyes found Marin across the 30 feet of deck plating and the crowd of dock workers and the 6 Pallori delegates and the station liaison and everything else between them. Her fur turned gold. Not gradually, not in a spreading wave. All at once, every fiber, the entire animal blazing gold in the fluorescent light of the docking corridor, and it held for 3 seconds, 4, 5, and Marin could feel it in her chest even at 30 feet. The warmth, the recognition, the thing that did not have a word in any language. And then Solène turned and walked into the transport, and the ramp closed behind her. Marin did not cry. She stood in the docking corridor, and she did not cry, and Clover leaned against her legs. 143 pounds of warm weight pressing into her. And the corridor emptied, and the transport's engine spun up, and the docking clamps released, and the ship pulled away from Tesek 4 and slid into the shipping lane and was gone. Then Marin sat on the deck and put her arms around her dog and cried. Clover did not move. She did not try to lick the tears. She did not wag her tail. She did not do anything except sit there, enormous and warm and patient, and let Marin hold on. And her heartbeat was 62 beats per minute, the same as always, the same as it had been in the dark when the station shuddered, and in the hydroponics wing when Solène was dying, and on the bed at night when the only sound was breathing. And it would be the same tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that, because Clover did not know how to be anything other than what she was, which was here. David Calloway found them 20 minutes later. He did not say anything. He sat down on the deck beside his daughter and put his arm around her shoulders and his other hand on Clover's head, and the 3 of them sat in the empty docking corridor, while the station hummed around them, and the host star climbed the viewport, and the day began. 3 months later, Marin received a package in the station's mail drop. It was small, wrapped in pale Pallori fabric, addressed to Marin Calloway and companion, Tesek 4. Inside was a collar tag. It was made of silver cord woven in the Pallori diplomatic style, and on one side was a glyph that Marin did not recognize, and on the other side, in small, precise Terran standard letters, was a word. Steadfast. Marin clipped it to Clover's collar, beside the old brass tag from Earth. Clover looked at her, tail wagging, drool pooling, ears dragging. 143 pounds of blunt, stubborn, unshakable love wearing 2 tags now instead of 1. And Marin put her hand on the big warm head and said, "Good girl." Clover's tail swept the floor once. That was enough. That was always enough.